So our first conference is the new Mass legitimate? And what I hope to do with this conference is to sort of lay a framework, to go through some general principles, and then my fellow colleagues who we will be engaging with the next few days are going to, I think, fill in parts of the argument. So my goal is to frame the argument, establish the principles, and then we'll be looking at different aspects of those in detail over the next 2 days. This is, as I mentioned for those of you who were here last night, this is a critical question. Is the new Mass legitimate? Because if it is, then we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. That everything that's been done for the past 50 years should not have been done. Because if merely we just said, well, we just like the traditional Mass, and the new Mass is fine, there's nothing wrong, it's just not our preference, then we cannot resist. Much like the Cornishman we spoke about last night who resisted the Cranmer prayer book, if it were not wrong, then they were in the wrong. So this question is very, very important. So let's begin by defining a couple of terms. These are the three critical terms for this discussion: valid, licit, and legitimate. So what does it mean valid? We say, is the new Mass valid? That means, very narrowly, is the Blessed Sacrament confected? Does it validly transubstantiate the bread and wine into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ? Is there a proper form, manner, intention by a valid minister? We are not addressing this question today. This is not the question. I'm, first of all, not a theologian. This is a theological question for someone in sacramental theology. That is not our question. Now, you might say, well, isn't it enough? Can't we just say, is it valid? No, it's not the proper question. Because we could have a valid instance of the sacrament that is still illegitimate and we should not participate in. And I want to give you a good example from the English Reformation we talked about. The Church has never definitively ruled on the prayer book services that were conducted by priests who were validly ordained at that first instance of its first introduction. So by the time the new ordinal was introduced and they lost apostolic succession and there were no ministers, Leo XIII ruled there were no valid orders. So clearly there were no valid sacraments after that point. But at the period in England when their new Mass was introduced, you had valid priests during the time 1549. You had valid priests who were ordained during the reign of Queen Mary, clearly. And if they had the proper intention, is an open question. It is possible that they were validly confecting the sacrament. But again, the Cornishmen who revolted did not go in and say, well, I'm trying to figure out if you validly confected the sacrament. They said, this is but a Christmas game. This is not the Mass, right? So the question wasn't one purely of validity of the sacrament, right? And again, the Church has always taught in her law a heretical heretical priest who is separated from the Church can validly confect the sacrament if they have valid orders, but we're not to go to that Mass just because it's valid. So again, that's an important point. We often misfocus the question. It's not whether there's just a minimal validity, right? It's whether the actual entire legislative act of promulgating the new Mass is licit, legitimate. Now, let's turn to those terms, because that's going to be our focus. So what does it mean to be licit? For something to be licit, it is permissible. It is a permissible exercise of power. It is a permissible exercise of the legislator. So licit means that, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a moment, that the conditions are properly there for the act of the governor of a society to promulgate a law which is in accordance with higher law. So is it a licit legal act? St. Thomas, as we'll talk about, calls it, is it a legal law or an illegal law? Finally, is it legitimate? Now, what do I mean by legitimate? Well, etymologically, legitimate comes from the Latin, meaning to bind. So it just simply meant to bind something to another. In a legal context, are we bound by the law? Are we bound to go and attend the new Mass? So is it a legitimate obligation? So that's our general question. As I said, we have to talk a little bit about defining what these mean in a little more detail. So there we have valid, licit, and legitimate, our three definitions. We're focusing on the latter of the two of those. Now, when we evaluate any action, because we're going to evaluate the action of Paul VI in promulgating the new Mass, we always have to look at three things: the thing itself, what is the action being performed? We'll look at it. What is the intention behind the action, right? And then what are the circumstances? All three of these factors can affect the goodness or not of a particular action. Right? So certain things in and of themselves are intrinsically good or intrinsically evil. So by looking at them, we say, okay, now we know. Other things can be good or can be used for evil depending on the intention for which they're used. And finally, even something with a good intention, if done in a way or under certain circumstances that affect that action, can therefore be viewed as morally illicit. Now, what do we mean we say bad or evil? Something can be bad in two senses. One is it is not proportionally ordered to a good. So there can be maybe a good intention or something it's reaching for, but is not proportionally ordered towards it. It is not aligned with its end. So all human actions have an end. We are beings of purpose. We act for an end. And in evaluating our means, we say, is this means proportionate or appropriate to that end? So I'm going to give you a silly example, right? If I say, well, I want to go from Chicago to England. And I say, well, I'm going to go get a rocket, and I'm going to use a rocket to fly to England for $20 million. Okay, that is ordered to the end, but is so disproportionate, such a waste of money that you wouldn't fly a rocket to go up into outer space to come down in England, right? It is totally disproportionate. It's not aligned properly to its end. Another way it can be disproportionate is it can be maybe a good action as a means, but it is not directed towards a good end, right? So I could be mixing up some poison. And if I'm mixing it up so as to kill a rat that is, in my house and, eating our food, that action, right, is proportionate to a particular end, guarding our food against being taken, right? However, if I mix up that, right, toward the end of poisoning, my neighbor, it's not good. So we have to have this relationship between what we're doing and its end being proportional. But in another way, it can be a deprivation of a do-good. So something can be bad because there's something we ought to do and we don't do it, right? We deprive the goodness of its existence. And so easy example is we owe in justice a duty to God to honor him, right? Even if we don't dishonor him, so we don't blaspheme, if we neglect to honor him, neglect to give him what he's due, we also are not fulfilling our duty and are depriving God of the honor to which he is due. Now, to apply these specifically to a legal act, because the promulgation of the new Mass is a legal act of the Church, right? It was promulgated by a pope, and so we have to evaluate it like all legal acts which are undertaken on earth, right? And there are sort of two general types of legislation. There's secular legislation governing the temporal order towards our temporal common good, and ecclesiastical legislation that the Church makes to guide us to our end. What's important in both of those cases, any laws that are made are delegations from God. All power comes from God. All authority comes from God. Right? As our Lord said to Pilate, you would have no authority unless it were given to you from above. Every human agent, even the vicar of Christ on earth, is acting on God's authority, not on his own authority. Right? And so all human laws, whether they be civil or ecclesiastical, that are made by men, are made under the authority that's delegated by God, and therefore, even if at the highest level, the Pope himself is the supreme authority on earth, exercising that authority is always subject to the higher law that gives that delegation. So we have a hierarchy of laws, right? The divine law and the natural law, both created by God, and they are always applicable to evaluate any exercise of specific ecclesiastical or secular law. Again, it's an important point. In ages past, we might not have to spend much time on this, but in the modern world, we've lived in a world where we're so inundated with legal positivism. This is the view that whatever the human lawmaker says is by definition good, and is by definition it's the law. Right? So if the civil authorities say two people of the same sex can get married, well, I may not like it, but that's the law now. Got to accept it. Wrong, right? That is not the way lawmaking works, because God entrusts this, and he didn't have to do this. We see in the Old Testament, he did not entrust much lawmaking authority to the Old Testament chosen people. He made very specific laws for them because he said, your hearts are hardened. You are not living in the time of grace. I'm going to make very specific rules. If you read the Old Testament, it's filled with particular laws. But because of the coming of grace, God withdrew, gave a greater authority to man to make the detailed rules. But those detailed rules are always subject to these higher laws. Now, the divine law is always binding. It is incapable of any human exception. So when God makes a divine law, he said there's 7 sacraments. We have no authority to say, well, we think, as Luther and others did, well, there's really 5 or 2 or 12. We cannot make any exceptions. We cannot change that because that is an aspect of the divine law in which God is very specific. Human law has an end to implement the divine law. And again, here we're just speaking of the church, so we're focusing on divine law as opposed to natural law. When the church makes a law, those laws are capable of exception. Why? Because as St. Thomas says, the more you get into detail, the more specific the law comes. And when you have a human lawmaker who is non-omniscient, the lawmaker cannot foresee all circumstances, and therefore it is capable of derogations, of exceptions, because in certain instances the human law doesn't attain its end, doesn't reach the end of the higher law of the divine law. So let's look at an important example of this. The divine law, the third commandment. This is a commandment purely of divine law. It is honoring God on a particular day is not anything we could have discovered on our own. The general duty to honor God is there. We can know naturally. But to have a Sabbath, to have a day dedicated to God in the third commandment, remember thou shalt keep holy the Sabbath, is a precept of divine law. It is incapable of exception. There is no circumstance under which we can say we can disregard the Sabbath. No matter what, even if we're sick in bed, we're very ill, we still have to honor the Sabbath in some way. Now, the third commandment is not specific. It doesn't say what you have to do to honor the Sabbath. Again, in the old law, there were very particular rules that God promulgated for the chosen people. He then transferred that authority to the church to give specific ways. Right? Again, another example. Natural law, we have to be careful about the way we drive so as not to injure people. But how do we do that? Well, can we drive 60 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour? The general duties there, the particular speed limit or laws made by the civil authorities to make it more concrete. So the same thing, the church has a precept, one of the basic precepts of the church, of human law, to hear Mass on Sunday. So the way we're to honor the third commandment, hear Mass on Sunday, but that human law is capable of exception, as the church recognizes herself, because it's a human law. So if we're ill, if we're morally impeded or physically impeded, if we're living in a country where there is no Mass, right, and Japan for hundreds of years, obviously there's an exception. The church says, well, you are not bound by the specific human precept of honoring God by hearing Mass on Sunday, but that doesn't exempt you from the third commandment. You need to do something else, whether that's pray the Missal, pray your rosary, something to fulfill the third commandment. So it's important. It's a good example of how these laws interact. We are never free to disregard a divine precept. The church will make laws that will help us to fulfill that. They are imperfect laws. They are capable of exception, and they always have to be evaluated in light of this end. So if, again, God forbid, an example, the church said, well, to honor the Sabbath, you have to blaspheme. I mean, sad to say, we're living in a time where that may not be, out of the question. Someone could say that. We look at that and say, well, we can't do that. That is not oriented towards the end of honoring God. Right? And like St. Paul says, we have to honor God before men. And that's why what St. Thomas tells us, if we ever find a human law that does not achieve its end, that is not oriented to the purpose that God created the authority to make that law for, it is no law at all. He quotes St. Augustine. He says, a law that is not properly ordered to its end is no law, and he even calls it an illegal law. It's kind of a bizarre word, right? An illegal law. It says essentially it purports to be law, but since the end of law is justice, or this is the more general terms, the divine and natural law, a human law which does not direct to it is no law at all, does not bind in conscience. And again, that's St. Thomas Aquinas laying out clearly the history of the church. So we can never do or be obligated to attend evil so that good may be done. So again, another important principle. We can never say, well, this thing's bad, this bad action, but I want to have good come out of it. This is very much the dangers, one of the 7 heresies that are talked about in the letter Matt referred to, very much underlying it. Well, you can engage in adulterous sexual intercourse because your intention is good. You want to protect the children and have a good life for your children. Never. We can never say, I'm going to do something wrong for a good purpose. I'm just going to get power through this thing that I know is not good, but it's for a good end. Never do that. Our ends and our means all must be good. So our ends can never justify our means. We can do good, however, not intending the evil, if the evil side effect is not out of proportion to the good. So we always have to evaluate, first of all, is the means bad, that we can't do it, and we actually intend the means. So we're actually intending to do the means, right? I'm intending to engage in this adulterous relationship, even though my end is good. That's wrong. But even if we say I don't want that means, I don't intend it, but it's a negative sort of side effect. So in a war, for example, you're fighting the enemy, and it's possible you don't intend it, but some of the fire may go off course and may damage a home or injure a civilian. You say, I don't intend that, I'm not aiming for them, I'm not trying, but I know as effect of shooting at the enemy, which is legitimate, it might happen. I'm not intending it, that action would be okay. Now, if I go up and say, hey, here's my chance, I see the soldier over there, I'm just going to sort of aim this way and happily hit this my neighbor's house whom I've never liked, right? Then I'm intending the evil. So we always have to evaluate from both of these perspectives when we're dealing with actions that are, again, problematic or evil. So let's look at intention. Because we're going to talk about the Mass. So we say, what is the intention that the Mass is supposed to have? What is it to be oriented to? And then we can evaluate the new Mass itself. The end of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, according to Baltimore Catechism, are 4. To honor and glorify God, adoration, to thank him for all the graces bestowed upon us and the whole world, thanksgiving, to satisfy God's justice for the sins of men, expiation, to obtain all graces and blessings, petition. Right? Little review of the Baltimore Catechism. All 4. So this is what God has revealed to us as the end of the Mass. Anything we do as human lawmakers has to be oriented to this end. We're going to focus on 2 of them because two of them are most problematic with the new ritual. So, adoration. What is adoration? An act of religion offered to God in acknowledgement of his supreme perfection and dominion and of the creature's dependence upon him. Now, what are the offenses which conflict with the adoration of God? So we know something through the positive and the negative. What is it and what is it not? First of all, worship offered to false idols. But 2, and I've emphasized this one, worship offered to the true God. Okay, so new Mass, we're intending to worship God, but in a false, unworthy, and scandalous manner. So again, this is why what's important. Even if you say, well, look, the new Mass, we're intending to worship God. The intention's good, okay, but that's not enough. But if the manner in which that improper intention is acted is unworthy or scandalous, it is a violation against our duty to worship God. So let's just take a brief comparison. How does the true Mass, the traditional Mass, compare? Well, the traditional Latin Mass uses elevated language. So if we're worshiping a supreme being, our language should be fittingly appropriate for that, fitting to address a supreme creator. There are multiple genuflections throughout the Mass. Again, we're expressing adoration, our creature's dependence upon him. The triple genuflection at the consecration, for example. Again, many other speakers will get into the details. My goal is just to highlight a few. Novus Ordo. Systemic elimination of genuflections at the Creed, for example. So how do we show our dependence on God? To genuflect at the Incarnation. Eliminate it. Just one example. One, or in the cases, sadly, of the Holy Father, none. No genuflections at all, even at the consecration. Again, so which of those is an example of adoration. Now, I wanted to show a short video, so a little public service announcement. These videos contain disturbing images. If you are a true Catholic, be prepared. But, I remember John used to show some things that were pretty disturbing. I saw his one when he went undercover at Steubenville about the Charismatics. So let's take a look. And I want to show you in these videos that I'm showing to visually make this point, I've chosen masses from around the world. So they're not just sort of, here's the best of one. Throughout them, there's a bit of a low mass, a solemn mass. Of the new mass, they're ones from all over the world. So it's not just, I picked one. So here's our first comparison. More to come. But again, if you take a child, not a Catholic, someone who knows nothing about, and say, I'm just going to show you these two things. Which looks like these people are adoring and worshiping a supreme and omnipotent being on whom they are totally dependent, and which looks like they're having a party? I think at a natural level, it's very obvious. Well, moving from the obvious to more scholarly critique, we have the study which was done of the new Mass by Roman theologians, and which was presented to Paul VI when he promulgated it before its introduction, and which was introduced in a letter by Cardinal Ottaviani and Bacci. What does it say? This end, and they're speaking about adoration, this end has disappeared from the offertory. With the disappearance of the prayer Suscipe Sancte Trinitas, from the end of the Mass, with the omission of the Placeat Tibi Sancta Trinitas, and from the preface, which on Sunday will no longer be that of the Most Holy Trinity, as the preface will be reserved only to the Feast of the Holy Trinity. So again, what is their conclusion? If the end of the Mass is adoration of God, this end has been eliminated, and they cite these few examples. So if we're evaluating the end of the new Mass, they're saying its end has, one of the four, has been systematically eliminated from the Mass. That's their conclusion. So we see the new Mass does not fulfill one of its four purposes. Expiation, the second one we'll look at. So expiation is the offering of a sacrifice in atonement for sin. What is a sacrifice? A sacrifice is the offering of an object by a priest to God alone, and the consuming of it to acknowledge that he is the creator and Lord of all things. Remember, this was one of the key eliminations in the Protestant Reformation to the Cranmer Book of Common Prayer. Complete elimination of expiatory sacrifice, to remove it from the purpose, to change the Mass into what Cranmer called the Lord's Supper, the same phrase used in the general instruction of the Roman Missal to describe the Mass. And so let's look at some basic, again, very high-level comparisons. Traditional Latin Mass, constant reminder of sins. So if your goal is to expiate for sins, you need to remember there are sins to be expiated for. If you never talk about it, right? If I just sort of drop off a gift, and I'm, well, here's a birthday gift for you, or I want to give this to you in sympathy for you had a death in the family, you need to express what you're doing, the intention for which you're offering the gift. So the traditional Latin Mass, from the very first words of Mass, right, reminds the priest and the people we are unworthy, we need expiation, we need the sacrifice. The Offer a Nos, the triple Confiteor throughout the two in the beginning, the one before communion, the offertory of the host, the triple Domine non sum dignus, Lord, I am not worthy, but only say the word and my soul shall be healed. The need for expiation throughout. The propers of the Mass constantly express the need for forgiveness. The new Mass, again, systematic removal of references to sin and sacrifice. And our brief comparison that we will do is the prayers of the offertory, or the so-called preparation of the gifts in the new Mass. Here's the offertory that we heard this morning. Take away from us our iniquities, we beseech thee, O Lord, that with pure minds we may be made worthy to enter into the Holy of Holies through Christ our Lord. Amen. Right? Not at the offertory. This is the prayer, from the beginning. This prayer, as the priest says as he ascends, the Novus Ordo Mass deleted. So this prayer the priest says as he ascends the altar, clear reminder, we need to have our sins taken away from us, eliminated in the new Mass. Before the Novus Ordo Confiteor, if they have one, since it's optional, here's what's said. Brethren, let us acknowledge our sins, and so prepare ourselves to celebrate the sacred mysteries. Notice the difference. We have sins, they need to be forgiven. Well, let's just acknowledge we have them. Wait, you're missing the second half of the sentence. Oh, let me just acknowledge that I'm a public adulterer. Well, great, I'm not. That was an example. But it'll be on the internet blogs. McCall admits he's a public adulterer, right? Catholic Family News goes liberal, right? There it goes. But to acknowledge what you are doesn't do anything unless you say, I need to change, right? So notice it's a subtle difference, but an incredibly important one. No need for expiation. So now here the offertory. Here's the offertory in the true Mass. Receive, O Holy Father, Almighty and Eternal God, this spotless host, which I, thy unworthy servant, need for expiation again, right? Offer unto thee, my living and true God, for my innumerable sins, offenses, and negligences, for all here present, for all the faithful Christians, both living and dead, that it may profit me and them for salvation unto life everlasting. Why did this prayer have to get removed by Cranmer? Because you cannot say this prayer and not express that this is a sacrifice for sin. There's no way around it, right? It is in your face, in a good sense, right? It is there. You cannot deny it. What's the equivalent? The equivalent comes from the Jewish blessing before meals. If you never knew that, that's where this prayer comes from. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation, for through your goodness we have received this bread we offer you, fruit of the earth and work of human hands. It will become for us the bread of life. Nothing about sin, sacrifice, need for expiation. I also emphasized, although it's not our focus in this conference, remember we said last night Cranmer was the master of ambiguity. That little phrase, for us, is meant so that a Protestant could say this prayer with a different intention. One of the Protestant errors against transubstantiation is that Christ is present not because of an actual change of the elements, not because of a substantial change, but because Christ is present because we intend him to be there. Through our faith, he's there. In analogous sense, they didn't express it this way, but like a spiritual communion. So when you make a spiritual communion, because of your faith, Christ makes himself present to you in a certain way, not in the same way that he does on the altar. So notice, if you're Catholic, you could say this prayer and say, oh yeah, this will become for us the bread of life. It will become, well, notice bread of life is also ambiguous. What's that mean? But assuming you apply the right interpretation, you could say that and perhaps intend it. But a Protestant could equally say those words and say, oh, that's what I mean, that this bread and wine, which we offer, just becomes in our hearts for us Christ's presence, or the bread of life, whatever that means. Master of ambiguity. But you can say this prayer and expiation is not clearly there. The congregation is more important than the Eucharistic rite, and the laity more important than the priest. That was Romano Amerio's conclusion. It too has been deviated from this intention of expiation. For instead of putting the stress on the remission of sins of the living and the dead, it lays emphasis on the nourishment and sanctification of the present. Wherever the nature of the sacrifice, it is absolutely necessary that it be pleasing and acceptable to God. After the fall, no sacrifice can claim to be acceptable in its own right other than the sacrifice of Christ. The Novus Ordo changes the nature of the offering, turning it into a sort of exchange of gifts between man and God. Man brings the bread, and God turns it into the, quote, bread of life. Man brings the wine, God turns it into, quote, spiritual drink. Not the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, but what spiritual drink mean? And again, that's not me, that's the Ottaviani intervention. The mystery of the cross is no longer explicitly expressed. It is only there obscurely, veiled, imperceptible for the people. And again, why is that important? Just like Cranmer? Because that's how you get people on board. Because if you want to say, well, I'm going to go along with this bad thing, you can rationalize it by saying, well, here's what I mean by these words, even though it is veiled. Okay, let's go back to our videos. Here's another, again, multiple comparisons. Just going to ask you, put aside all the scholarly commentary, which one of these looks like an offering to God, expiation for sins, and which like just a celebration of gifts? Right. Okay, this is my commentary on the new Mass in America. Look at the age of everybody there. They literally have to wheel them in wheelchairs to do this. And here, obviously, the traditional Mass, we see the subdeacon preparing the sacrifice, veiled. Right, again, well, it's obvious.
Benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui.
Notice the offering, the actual offering. I will point out this music was from their video from this parish. I didn't add it. It is the meditation from Thais, which is a story about a monk who loses his, who commits a sin against chastity. That's the music they're playing, whether they know it or not.
Time he was betrayed and entered willingly into his passion, he took bread and giving thanks broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you."
no genuflection.
Lambda sac venerabilis manus suas, et elevatis oculis in ce. Fregit, deditque discipulis suis.
Again, there are things we need to study. We're going to look at a few more commentary, but I think a picture speaks 1,000 words. Right? Like, show them to someone who doesn't know Catholic doctrine and say, which one of these looks like a priest offering sacrifice to God alone and which doesn't. Right? Small thing you may have noticed, because again, I love the liturgical innovators are always coming up with stories, that they want to restore things to the ancient way they were. Right? Well, if you notice the end of the offering, if you may have seen the priest, when he makes the offering of the gifts of the offertory, he makes a sign of the cross with them and illuminated in the new Mass. He holds them up to God to offer them and makes the sign of the cross. We know from historical evidence that goes back to the temple in Jerusalem. And they didn't even realize it. This was God, again, prefiguring. They were instructed, the priests in the temple, when the animals were sacrificed at the offering, to move them to the north, south, east, and west. The Jewish priests were making the sign of the cross, again, not knowing it, in anticipation. So again, these liturgical innovators, we're going back to the ancient practice, which we're eliminating. Right? You can't trust these people, as John would say. I remember him saying that so many times. You can't trust these people. So what can we say about the intention? Well, we can judge the intention from the thing itself. We watch those videos. What intention comes through in those actions? That's one way, right? So I see you doing something. I see you preparing poison and pouring it in someone's glass. I can pretty much tell your intention. But I can also ask you, what are you doing? What's your intention? So let's turn to what the intention was. And I wanted to deal briefly with this, because a lot of times some of the Reform folks will say, well, the Novus Ordo, it's just an aberration, it's just an abuse. The Council didn't intend it. No. This was intended. The Novus Ordo was intended to eliminate these things, to make these changes. So we're going to look at a couple of excerpts from the first document passed at Vatican II, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. This sacred council has several aims in view. So again, one way to know someone's intention, they tell you. This document says, here's our intention, here's our aim. It desires to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful. We're talking about the Mass here. Our intention is the faithful, not God. What was our end? Adoration, expiation towards God. To adapt more suitably to the needs of our times those institutions which are subject to change. So again, not to adapt them to the needs of God or the fittingness of God, but to us. That's their stated intention. To foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ. Well, what can promote union? A false union, ambiguity. Create an offertory prayer that both a Protestant and a Catholic can say. And I will tell you, I've seen this in my own eyes. When we went to England, we went to Walsingham to see the shrine, the great shrine to Our Lady that had been destroyed by the Protestants. Well, some conservative Protestants have rebuilt it on the spot where it used to be. So they have the replication of the Holy House of Loreto that used to be the shrine in Walsingham, but it's now an Anglican church. So we went in to just look at it for historical, because they've recreated what it originally looked like. Leave it to the Anglicans, it's so Anglican. We're going to throw out the belief, but wow, this was a really nice historical artifact. Let's recreate it, even though we don't believe in it anymore. Yeah, well, just like, they worship the true absence in their non-consecration. But anyway, we go in, and I'm listening. There's something going on up in the altar. And I'm like, are you sure this is an Anglican church? Like, that looks like the Novus Ordo. And this vicarette comes up to me and she says, oh yes, here we say the Mass of Paul VI because we see it perfectly compatible with our theology. Again, you don't need a scholar. This is clearly done if it can be said by an Anglican group and say there's nothing against their faith. What was done was this aim, to remove it of anything that will make it acceptable to non-Catholics. This was the end of the council, not the people that came later. The council also desires that where necessary, the rites be revised, right there. They want it done. They want them revised, that they be given new vigor to meet the circumstances and needs of modern man. That's the end, and that's what we got. If you intend something, that's what you're going to produce, and that's what was intended. So, aims are a little recap. 1, the focus of the Novus Ordo is not on the worship of God, but the life of the people, the community, just as we saw in this document passed by Vatican II. 2, it adapts the liturgy to our modern times, not to God. He's not the end. We are. 3rd, ecumenism. These are the 3 ends that Vatican II said they were pursuing in requiring the reform of the liturgy. Another quote, "The full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else." That's incredible. That means before the adoration of God, right? Before all else, without exception. The aim we're seeking is the full and active participation of the people before the expiatory sacrifice. I mean, fill in anything you want because they say all. And although when they went to translate in English, they didn't remember this, all means all. Many means many. They got a little confused in the translation, if you remember, at the consecration of the wine. But all means all. Before all else, this is their aim. This is not me. This is the document itself. The definition of sacrifice by a priest is therefore incompatible with this end. The full participation, we cannot fully participate in the same way as the priest participates because he is the priest offering the sacrifice. We can unite our intentions, we can unite ourselves to him, but we are not the priest. So you never have this aim that they put forward. Above all else, above the due worship of God is this aim. So we see from even before the first pen was put to paper, writing the prayers of the new Mass, the intention is problematic. Provision shall also be made, when revising the liturgical books, for legitimate variations and adaptations to different groups, regions, and people, especially in mission lands. So again, you saw a few excerpts from mission lands. This is where it came from. Again, what's the goal? What is fitting for God? Or what do people in the local community here like? Remember I said if we're just attached to the old Mass because we like it, it's problematic. Right? It needs to be, our attachment needs to be because it fulfills its end. Again, little quick funny story for you. True story. In the early 20th century, there's a big state dinner in Spain, royal dinner, and the English ambassador is there. So the priest gets up to bless the food. Benedict Domine nos et haec tuit, right, says the prayer. He sits down, the English ambassador happens to be next to him, he says, "Hey, Padre, I could not understand a word you were saying." The priest looked at him and said, "Well, that's fine, I wasn't speaking to you." What is our end? Is this to speak to us or to speak to God? If I'm saying, "God, I'm here to worship you," now let me go talk to everybody else over here. Am I speaking to him? I'm not even speaking to him if I'm focused on myself. Again, that's what the document calls for. Adapt the liturgy. Who are the people it's directed towards? Not God, the people. In some places and circumstances, an even more radical adaptation of the liturgy is needed. So again, if somebody tells you Vatican II didn't intend the radical adaptation of the Mass in the Novus Ordo, quote it. It's right there. It intended it. An even more radical adaptation than we just read before is intended. Now, we can also look at, and Mr. Wallier and his conference may go more into this, the specific people who wrote the new Mass. So the concilium established by Paul VI, its secretary was Hannibal Bugnini. If you didn't know that, Annibale is Italian for Hannibal. Hannibal is the general from Carthage who sacked Rome. I'm just saying, his parents obviously chose to name him. It's just interesting to me. Because what did Bugnini call the new Mass? A conquest of the Catholic Church. That was his words. I think it's God's sense of humor. In any event, he was the principal architect behind the new Mass. He was the driving force in the concilium. In March of 1965, in his periodical, Bugnini is quoted as saying, "We must strip from our Catholic prayers and from the Catholic liturgy everything which can be the shadow of a stumbling block for our separated brethren, that is, for the Protestants." That's his stated goal. That's what he's working to do in writing the new Mass. Well, that to me begs a question. What if Christ and his doctrine are the stumbling block to the Protestants? He said we have to remove everything that's a stumbling block. Well, what if it's Christ and his doctrine that's the stumbling block? By his words, got to throw it out. It's an incredible statement. Maybe you've read it many times. We tend to sort of, oh yeah, that's what Bugnini said. That's amazing to think about that. And remember, Christ is the stumbling block. We know that. I said it hypothetically. What if he is? He is the stumbling block. We have it from sacred scripture. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews indeed a stumbling block, and unto the Gentiles foolishness. So if we want to strip our Mass of anything that's offensive, that's a stumbling block, we're going to have to strip it of what it is Catholic. That's the intention. That's what we would get. So our final sort of conclusion here from the on the new Mass as a whole, the Novus Ordo represents, I'm sure you've seen this quote before, both as a whole and in its details, a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated in Session 22 of the Council of Trent. The canons of the Rite, definitively fixed at all times, provided an insurmountable barrier to its heresy affected against the integrity of the mystery. Right there. Our objection is not aesthetic. It's not because they have fruit on their head, primarily. It's doctrinal. The sacrifice of the Mass, as defined infallibly by Trent, has been eliminated from the new rite. The definition of the Mass is limited to that of the supper, the same word Cranmer used. And this term is found constantly repeated. This supper is further characterized as an assembly presided over by the priest. In our next conference, Father McMahon will come and expand upon this point, the change of the nature of the priesthood, and held as a memorial of the Lord, recalling what he did on the first Maundy Thursday. None of this is the very least implies either the real presence or the reality of the sacrifice, or the sacramental function of the consecrating priest, or the intrinsic value of the Eucharistic sacrifice, independently of the people's presence. It does not, in a word, imply any of the essential, right? Essential, it is of the essence, it is necessary, dogmatic values of the Mass, right? Which together provide its true definition. Again, Cardinal Ottaviani and Bacci intervene because the essential dogmatic character of the Mass had been eliminated. So, what do we conclude? The Novus Ordo Mass was not oriented to its proper ends. And we only focused on two because they're the most obvious, but the two ends of the Mass are not the object of the rite as it was written, adoration and expiation by sacrifice. The Novus Ordo Mass was created with bad intentions. Not just at the concilium level. There are intentions contrary to what the proper intentions are in the document giving birth to the whole process itself that we've seen. The Novus Ordo in its circumstances is contrary to the doctrine. So again, even if you have a minister like in England, right? A proper minister says, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to intend the right thing. The circumstances all around it are contrary to that intention and tear away from it. And again, those videos are meant to show some of those circumstances. Therefore, no Catholic can be compelled to participate in acts that are not pleasing to God. A law that compels someone to go against the end for which the law is instituted is not obligatory. And this is St. Thomas Aquinas. It is not a legitimate law. It is an illegitimate law. He says, a law that compels us to go against the divine law, the divine order established by God, is not binding in conscience. And if we prove that the new Mass has this end, has the circumstances that are not properly directed, it is not legitimate. It is not binding upon us. So we don't have to say, well, I have to go to Mass. I have no choice. I have to go to the new Mass. We are just like if you are a doctor and you're not licensed here in Illinois, but someone's dying on the side of the road, the law that says you have to get a license in Illinois doesn't apply. You don't say, well, I'll just have to sit here and watch you die. There's an exception because the law then, you have to have a license, not a bad law, have to attend Mass on Sunday, good law. But in this circumstance, the law doesn't function properly, and the doctor can save the life notwithstanding. The law to hear Mass on Sunday, a good law, but if the only way practically to fulfill it goes against the purpose of that law, we're not bound in conscience to obey it. Just like the West Country men were not bound to sit there and listen to the Cranmer 1549 prayer book. So Catholics who are aware of these, the law itself is therefore illicit. It is not a licit law. It was not a proper exercise of delegated authority to the governors of the church. Therefore, if we know that, and this is a critical distinction, right? Because we live in very, very confusing times. And you didn't create the new Mass. We didn't create it. People who are going to it didn't create it, and they may not know this. The grace of God may not have come to them to know this. Here we're just talking about someone who does. So if you know this is wrong, if you know that the intention is bad, it is something you should not morally participate in, right? Remember our principle. You can never do something that you know to be wrong because of good end. And again, I know this is maybe controversial. People may get a little ruffled. But if you hear people say, well, I know the new Mass is bad. I know it suppresses these things. But I want to go to receive communion. Good end, right? I want to go. That's a good end. That's noble. But if the means to it, God will never ask you to use means which are problematic morally to attain a good end. Again, that's the error in the moral teaching that's been coming, the immoral teaching that's been coming from the Vatican, this pontificate. If you have a good end, raising your children, God wills you to engage in an act which is not good, adultery, which is not properly ordered to marriage. It's an analogous situation, right? And that's why they want to trump up all these stories. I've had a lot of people emailing, well, what about this poor woman who had, in this circumstance, blah, blah, and they come with the most tragic story. She's trying to do the right thing. It doesn't ever justify doing something which you know to be wrong, right? Again, analogously, if you're in an invalid marriage, but you don't know it, right? There was a flaw, maybe there was a flaw in the original way you got married you're unaware of, right? You are still objectively engaging in something problematic. You're not culpable for it, right? Because you don't know. You didn't know that there had been this particular legal flaw in your original marriage, an impediment that you weren't aware of. Same thing. So again, not saying people go to new Mass or doing something wrong. It all comes down to our knowledge, though. But what's important is if we know these things, we're not bound to participate, nor really should we, given the circumstance. So I hope that, again, the argument is not complete. I've tried to do a really thorough job going through at the highest level with a few examples. So the next 2 days, then we're going to return to a lot of these topics and explore in more detail the material parts of that argument. So I've given you the form, and I'm really excited to hear what my colleagues will be saying the next few days to fill in a lot of those details. So thank you for your attention, and we'll see you at the next talk, which should begin in about 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you.